Hello. Sorry, one little item there. I was a little behind rushing around trying to get everything at the last second, and I forgot the sound for a minute. But anyway, welcome to our show today. Today is Tuesday, the 10th day of March, 2015. And we welcome you to our show where we share the reason for the hope within us, the reason why the Latter-day Saints Christians, and of course, the reason why uh, you should be too. Let me just check my sound levels here just for a second. I don't know if they're high enough. All right, well, maybe that's better. Um, have to be the operator here, the producer, and everything as well. Okay, so our message not only explains what distinguishes LDS Christian doctrine from non-LDS Christian doctrine, but it also explains why the Latter-day Saints have declared very crucially that the only salvation remaining for the Gentiles is for them to repent and to be baptized and thus to be identified in the same covenant and to worship at the same altar as Israel. Something very, very important to understand. And for this reason, we've discussed it going on for 2 years now. You can access the past episodes, or at least a year and 3/4. You can access all of the past episodes on our website, voicesfromthedust.org. Just go there and click on menu item TV. And there you can watch the program live. Click on one of the links that will take you to our YouTube channel or our Google Plus page or our Facebook page, which are all entitled Voices from the Dust. Okay, well, today we're going to be talking about, as anyone who's not sound asleep knows, this nation that's now on the verge of crumbling to pieces and tumbling to the ground. Its constitution is indeed on the brink of ruin. But what few people know is that these are the exact words used by the prophet Joseph Smith when he foresaw all of this, what we call our awful situation that constitutes our current condition. He saw all of it in the year 1840, according to the words of Martha Jane Knowlton, who wrote it down, recorded his words during the meeting that he had with the congregation of Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo, Illinois, in that year of 1840. Well, we discovered this not too long ago, mentioned it several times here on the program, and we've actually read the words, but recently the wife of a fellow ordnance worker of mine, while I was walking into the Ogden Temple with her and her husband, she handed me several sheets of paper upon which she compiled a set of quotes with references regarding the so-called white horse prophecy. Many Latter-day Saints are familiar with this. And on the first page was this quote of Joseph's from Miss Knowlton's account, where he predicted the downfall of the United States and its Constitution. I was surprised because it's a relatively obscure quote even today, but she went on to show the same sort of sentiment affirmed by the presidents and the leading brethren of the church since Brigham Young, where they assure the saints that the day would come when the Constitution would indeed hang by a thread and the saints would be instrumental in saving it. Well, in the meantime, the church denounces the so-called white horse prophecy, which more or less elaborates on that idea and purports to be a revelation alluding to the horses of the apocalypse and explaining the destiny of America in terms of those horses and their riders and so on, in connection with the events prophesied by Joseph. But the origin of that prophecy, white horse prophecy, is dubious. So the church has denied it and discounted it and has denounced it, really. But in all of this, what is curious to me is that it's never mentioned in the discussion among leading brethren of the church, as far as I can tell, what the connection is between Joseph's prophecy that we do have from Martha Jane Knowlton, where we know exactly who wrote it down and when, and there's no disputing its origin. The connection between that and the destiny of America and the Mormon Church with the parable of the nobleman's vineyard recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants section 101 that we've talked about extensively on our program, and also the book of the third Nephi, and that's related to it in the Book of Mormon, where the words of both of these come directly from the mouth of Jesus Christ himself. And yet that's not mentioned. And in fact, the quote that she quotes in this paper that I was surprised to see doesn't reference Martha Jane Knowlton, only a document in the history department of the church, and there's nothing else quoted there, yet that's just a small part of the whole thing that Joseph was explaining in the context of this parable that is recorded in chapter or in Doctrine in section 103, where the Lord says that he gives the parable so that we can understand his will concerning the redemption of Zion. Wow, which is what this is all about. So very curious indeed, and we'll continue to pursue this until we can find out how they want to interpret that section 101, verses 43 through 65, I think, and tell us what it is that it means. We've relied, as we've pointed out in our past discussions, on the words, the interpretation of Sidney B. Sperry, who is not only not an apostle, he was not even a general authority in the Mormon Church. So he was a scholar, he was a great man, he was instrumental in setting up the church's institute and seminary program. And it's in that context, they quote his words concerning the interpretation of the parable, but nothing from the prophets. So very interesting. But anyway, we've addressed it, as I said several times on our show, from various perspectives, but now we come to it again in a new context, this time in the current political and philosophical context of Western civilization's decline, as the globalist power of the Gentiles find themselves bankrupt and on the verge of tumbling to the ground, while the East is rising to take over the lead of mankind into the future. And all of this articulated in this show of that we've shown before, this work of Lyndon LaRouche, who puts it very articulately in his group, address that. So we're going to watch a video here in a minute, where the latest video where they're addressing this. It's important for us to understand that how Lyndon LaRouche perceives it, and he and his wife, how he and his wife are leading out in an intellectual and political movement, articulating an underlying philosophy, if not theology, that forges a fundamental strategy for awakening the sleeping masses in time to avert the tragedy of all-out nuclear war, and provide rationale, moreover, for following the lead set up by the nation of China, which is pressing forward into a future of solar system colonization. It's very interesting to see that, where we have abandoned our space program. Most people don't realize that China is pressing forward, and they're actually beginning to mine, explore, and eventually will be mining the moon for alternate forms of energy. And this is very, very interesting, and plays into what Lyndon LaRouche and company are doing. So let's turn to that. I actually maybe we'll wait a little bit because it's still downloading. I guess that the video from this past Monday, yesterday, was the download, but evidently it's taking quite a while because it's a pretty high definition video, evidently. So anyway, as I was saying, the fact that the globalist powers of the Gentiles are trying to lead the Western nations into a thermonuclear war has LaRouche totally not shrill, because it's a reasonable voice, but raising his voice to an unprecedented level to try to get the attention of Americans. And because he's saying, and of course it's not just him that's saying it, it's everyone that knows what's going on, that this thermonuclear war, the prospect of it portends the extinction of all mankind. And so it's an ancient, an urgent, not urgent, not ancient, but urgent message that the sleeping masses of the Western Gentile need to understand. These nations need to understand that, as those who are awake know, the globalist powers have managed to lull the masses to sleep and keep them in a pathetic state of ignorance through the media of mass communications and other means that are at their disposal. I mentioned before how I've tried to wake up my own family. Most of them won't pay attention. A lot of them mock me, but one that did manage to watch some of the things that I wanted to show her on YouTube about 9/11 and so on, and Building 7 coming down, and the BBC announcing its fall way before it fell down, and so on. All these indicators that the official explanation of 9/11 is just a ruse, and it's very misleading and deceptive, and that has led to many consequences. But as I tried to explain these to my daughter, who then, and also some friends, also some friends of mine who are fairly influential in their neighborhood, watched it, and they too acknowledged it. But in both cases, they said, what can we do about it? See, it was like it's so huge and it's so big that they couldn't do anything about it. And so they go on living their lives as if it will make no difference to them. But in reality, that's what slaves do. That's what the serfs of the Dark Ages did. They let the oligarchs rule over them, and their personal lives were totally disrupted to a point of unbelief if we read those things today. But we're going along that same path when we say, as they did, what can they do about it? They were helpless, and of course they had this religion that had been perverted, which the elite then used to keep them in line. See, when they had the power really in their masses to overthrow them, but that didn't happen until the Lord freed them and brought them to America. But at any rate, LaRouche and company recognize and lament the sad state of the general population's awareness of these important issues and their lack of understanding, and he attributes that, as we all do now who are awake, to the deliberate dumbing down of Americans in their school system, and by the manipulation of their of society, American society, not general Gentile society in general, by various means of mass media. And anyway, they use, that is, the LaRouche group uses the example of the Gentile Renaissance, the historical Renaissance that we read, where there was supposed to be an enlightenment that was due to the coming forth of the printing press and so on. but they focus particularly on the role of Francis Joan of Arc, an ordinary but inspired citizen who rises to change the course of history in a time of national desperation during the 15th century. And that has many parallels to our own situation today. So they're using that in that sense. So they talk about that here. If we can get the video downloaded, it's 96% of the way. So we're almost there. But the point they make is that Joan of Arc was a liberator, an inspired woman who determined to free her nation from tyranny by the gift and power of God, which not only led to her personal and her own nation's victory, but set in motion those forces that eventually led to the establishment of modern republics as free nations, especially the Republic of America, of the United States. But there's much more to the LaRouche gospel than the Joan of Arc story, which we will get into after we watch the video. So looks like that's done now. Let me play that, and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
Good afternoon. It's March 9th, 2015. I'd like to welcome everybody to our weekly broadcast with the LaRouche PAC Policy Committee. We're broadcasting today, as usual, over Google Hangouts on air. And I'm joined via video by Bill Roberts from Detroit, Michigan, Dave Christie from Seattle, Washington, Keisha Rogers from Houston, Texas, Michael Steger from San Francisco, California, and Rachel Brinkley from Boston, Massachusetts. And here in the studio, I'm joined by Diane Sayer and our special guest for this week, Jason Ross from the LaRouche PAC basement team. So I think the best place to start our discussion and to just get things moving is by referencing people's attention to the presentation that Megan Beats gave at the conclusion of the Friday night webcast this past Friday, in which she contextualized the importance of the life of Joan of Arc and the connection between Joan's mission and the birth of the Renaissance by the founding father of the European Renaissance, Nicholas of Cusa. And as people will see on our website this morning, Mr. LaRouche put a huge premium on this presentation by Megan Beats over the course of this weekend in discussions that we had with him, some of which can be summarized in this item that was posted this morning. So I think we can just start our discussion from here, and people can just feel free to take it away.
Well, I don't want to replicate what Megan went through, because it's true, what she presented was very succinct and very clear. And I think this relationship with Cusa, and then Cusa's role in unifying the church, which Mr. LaRouche was talking about in great detail on Saturday, making certain comparisons to our own association, and the question of Hamilton, you know, this only could have been done from the highest possible principle, because you can say, well, supposedly the purpose of the church, one of them is to worship God. And is it one God? Is it many gods? Is it, you know, what are people doing? What is their belief in each of these little separate parishes? And then the question of the split with the East, with the Eastern Orthodox Church at the time, which Cusa, I mean, did brilliant work in bringing together. But I think anyway, it's just an extraordinary process. It had never been as clear in my mind, the actual causal relationship between what she did, her mission, and then the developments of what Cusa did. And the other thing, just on what she was dealing with, because I keep thinking about this today, and we may get into it more later, is when you're in Dark Age conditions, I mean, what was she dealing with? An army which had given up, which was losing, which was scattered, and she was able to pull people together with a clear vision of mission and purpose. and you think about the kind of divisions, the kind of insanity that we're dealing with today in the population, where people are really demoralized, really dumbed down, and the question of how do we unify people on a higher principle, on something not based in popular opinion, which will never allow them to think straight. So I just think this was an incredibly important topic to put before the American population at this time.
Yeah, just what you concluded with. Some people may know the figure of Charles de Gaulle in France. And at the time when most of the French leadership was handing over French sovereignty to the invading Nazi forces and collaborating with the Germans, Charles de Gaulle, who was an institutional person in the military and so forth, went against all popular opinion in his country and said, "I will save France." And in that capacity, he compared himself to Joan of Arc, who said, you know, at the time, the King of France had given up, everybody was demoralized, just sort of opening up the country to the invading Norman forces and saying, this is it, there's no hope. And Joan of Arc said, me, even if it's as an individual, I will act to save my nation. And Charles de Gaulle had exactly the same idea of himself during World War II and led the resistance in a very, inspired way, which was natural that this would occur within France, because obviously the tradition of Joan of Arc is something that's deeply embedded in the historical memory and in the bones of Frenchmen. So, this is obviously an example of the long arm of history. And Mr. LaRouche was making the point, when you're dealing with people who are tasked with making historical policy decisions today, for example, the majority of the members of the United States Congress, what one of these people knows anything about the establishment of the nation-state movement, which led to the Italian Renaissance and led to the American Revolution? And yet they call themselves the custodians of the Constitution of the United States. This is an extremely significant thing that people have to know about if they're going to put themselves in the capacity of providing leadership for a great country such as ours.
One of our colleagues pointed out to me a passage from Barbara Tuchman in her The Distant Mirror on Joan of Arc, and it was a very powerful one-paragraph passage. I don't have the direct quote, but what it references is that Joan of Arc's mission, she says that Joan of Arc's mission was not a mission of chastity, of keeping her virginity, of being chastity, or being just having some type of, her mission wasn't just for her own religious purpose, but her mission, it directly said, was to free her nation from tyranny. And I thought that was very telling, because of the fact that she chose to carry out a mission to free the nation of France from the tyranny of an empire, is why we yet exist today as a republic, as a sovereign nation. What the idea that the U.S. Republic or this republic, nation states around the world were able to come about is because of the fact that you had a mission, which is what the people of the United States have a responsibility to take on right now. And in thinking about that, what's so unique, and in thinking of today, what the Prime Minister of Greece, the new Prime Minister of Greece, Tsipras, just said about if there was a referendum of Greece to come about on the decision of the Greek people to decide whether or not they would keep their dignity or go along with the continued policies of austerity and the continued EU policies and corruption that's being perpetrated against the Greek people and against nations throughout Europe, that they would choose their dignity. And the point being is, why would someone like Joan of Arc continue to choose that her dignity and the understanding of the dignity of the nation comes as a priority even at the cost of your life, even at the cost that you're going to maybe have to suffer some great setbacks or, death for that matter. And I thought that that was very important, looking at what Cypris said. Yes, they would choose their dignity. The question is whether or not the American people would do the same, and how we get the American people to say our dignity as human beings comes first, just as Joan of Arc chose. And I think that that's a very, important quality to actually address.
Mm-hmm. On the subject of the nation state, it's something that we really take for granted now, and we should remember that it didn't exist at Joan of Arc's time. France wasn't a nation state when she was throwing the English out of it. And her goal wasn't only to overthrow foreign tyrants and allow homegrown tyrants, to allow feudalist leaders to continue to rule France and treat the people like slaves, serfs, animals. That was not fully realized during her lifetime, of course, but the following king, she brought Charles VII to the throne, who was lousy. His son, Louis XI, is cited as being the first ruler of a real modern nation state in Europe, as was Henry VII in England. But if you look at what Louis XI had done in terms of bringing an internal sovereignty and a power of the nation state as a concept that's able to defend the common welfare, that's able to promote the commonwealth as a concept, this is something that only exists on the scale of a nation and can't exist when you've got feudal lords ruling each individual portion of a territory. And one example of something that Louis XI had done was to remove all taxes on grains. So that, because the way it would work is you'd have all these feudal lords. Anytime goods cross their boundaries on their way somewhere else, every single lord along the way could tax it. And this made it impossible to really develop any sort of internal trade, really develop the internal part of the nation. So, between that and then other policies on a national scale of supporting immigration of skilled workers, of using taxes and tax policy to promote productivity by having basically something similar to a progressive income tax, where noblemen who didn't do anything useful were taxed at a higher rate than were people living in a city actually doing something that was beneficial.
I think that's crucial. I mean, to think about this as a moment of political revolution in European civilization, but any political revolution must be based on a scientific revolution. You can't have one without the other. And if you look at what happened with the Renaissance and the role that Nicholas of Cusa played, you had a change in mankind's conception of himself, which was what was necessary to create the possibility of modern civilization, a modern nation state, sovereignty of the people for themselves. And one thing that occurred to me is that people don't generally recognize that Joan of Arc was contemporary with Brunelleschi. They were the same generation. Well, at the same time Joan of Arc was doing what she was doing in France, Brunelleschi was designing the Duomo in Florence, was laying the groundwork for the political revolution and a scientific revolution that Cusa brought to its fruition. And Mr. LaRouche was mentioning a few weeks ago, Brunelleschi was the architect, literally, of the Renaissance. He cast the shadows of the human mind, and then it was up to Cusa to recognize what the human mind was in and of itself. So, you think about this triad that Mr. LaRouche talked about of Brunelleschi, Cusa, and Kepler, and then you put the role that Joan of Arc played right into the middle of that as a contemporary, the same generation of Brunelleschi, and you get a vivid idea of what the Renaissance was about as both a political and a scientific revolution.
To add another dimension to this discussion too, because what comes up, you see with what you referenced, Matt, with Charles de Gaulle and the resurrection of a true identity of France when all of its leadership under Pétain had gone fascist. You see the same thing in Russia today, where you see a kind of a revitalization of a national identity of a positive nature. I mean, Russia has taken on numbers of major invasions of this fascist type policy in its history. So there's a real sense of that. And the question that comes up, how do you resurrect, or resuscitate, you might say, revitalize the true American identity? Because that's largely what's been lost in this process. I mean, there is no longer, I mean, these last 15 years, as Jeff has made the point on a number of the webcasts, our Constitution has been shredded these last 15 years since 9/11. The younger generation, since really born in the late 80s and now early 90s, emotionally is, they have what's, I guess, now described as emotional deprivation disorder. I mean, there's a lack of an emotional connection to the nation, to an idea, to what Joan of Arc really represents, which is what really the ultimate expression of a commitment to your nation. But as Schiller referenced it then, your nation as part of the human race and part of the human development as a whole culture. And that's really the question. How do we take back this culture which has been destroyed since the late 1800s, when Wall Street took over this country? When we had Hamilton and John Quincy Adams and Lincoln and others that really represent the culture of this country, how do we bring that back today? And Joan probably is the most significant example of that.
One effect of this dumbing down, I mean, just reflecting on the challenges to get the American population to shift, because clearly we have to shift. We've had a number of discussions now, really over 3 years, about the likelihood of a thermonuclear war, that Britain, the British Empire, using their tool Obama and NATO, are provoking Russia. And now it's even more brazen because you had the ceasefire. You had a ceasefire in Ukraine, and no sooner do we get the ceasefire than you have a drive in the US Congress to send weapons to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly we don't want the ceasefire from here. The idea is to provoke Russia, and you have these silly debates. And I was very struck in New Jersey. People may know that Senator Menendez has now come into some trouble, and he is one of the primary people who wants to arm the Nazis in Ukraine. He also, consistent with that, is his support for Bibi Netanyahu's address to the US Congress, who, as former Mossad chief Meir Dagan said, Bibi Netanyahu is more frightening than the enemies of Israel. He is destroying the country, and the economy of Israel is in a shambles, and that's what Israelis are most concerned about. That aside, so what's the line now? Menendez, who probably is a corrupt crook, who is completely owned by Wall Street, may or may not have done something questionable with a friend of his. I'm sure there's much more if they wanted to get a more serious case. But the line is that Obama didn't like that Menendez crossed him by supporting Bibi Netanyahu. So Obama is running a political vendetta against Menendez, who is now being supported by intellectual giant Ted Cruz. And you look at this and you say, this is the most insane logic and argument. Even if it were, it's like, Hitler versus Caligula or something. And people, I ran into this, with some people that I knew from my campaigns, various campaigns in New Jersey, are drawn into the most inane argument, trying to defend Menendez because of Netanyahu, and the whole thing is insane. And meanwhile, we are marching ever closer toward thermonuclear war, and that is not even a topic of discussion. And you have a president who, in effect, wants to lay the blame for the assassination of Boris Nemtsov at Putin's feet, when Putin would have absolutely no interest in having done such a thing, since he enjoys an 85% approval rating. But my point more is the American people, because Mr. LaRouche pointed out, I think it was last week or in a webcast, that you have this spike in suicides among middle-aged Americans. that the population has actually become depraved. And
Okay, we'll leave it there for now, because she gets off into some things that we don't want to talk about right now. But this idea of Joan of Arc rising up, in the middle of this triad of Cusa, Kepler, and Brunelleschi is something that's really important. It's a message that is actually based on a historical view that establishes this vision of Cardinal Nicholas de Cusa. He was a Christian mystic who wrote something called The Vision of God. And then together with the work of Johannes Kepler, regarded as the first scientific break with the Aristotelian past, where we broke from the Aristotle view of science. And then the fact that Kepler was able to do this by embracing the ideas of Cusa, and thus that made it possible to do what he did. And of course, without Kepler's view of the solar system, we would have been put back for a long ways. But they go into the details of how he did that, and they see how he relied on the ideas of Cusa to make that possible. In fact, they have a very interesting website that's just dedicated to explaining what Kepler actually accomplished in the context of Cusa's ideas. So, but what LaRouche and company want is for America, and we see this from the video that we just watched, to understand that a return to these ideas is embraced by our founding fathers, especially Alexander Hamilton, is the only way to global salvation, the only way that we're going to get out of this awful situation that we're in, you see. They understand the global community of sovereign states. They envision, see, this global community of sovereign states, each dedicated to the individual welfare and security of the others that are members of the same community, requires that the Gentiles of America and Europe grow up and follow the example of collaboration for the common good rather than seeking world domination as they're doing now. And LaRouche has gone to China and to other places, and he's made these big speeches, and they're wowed by them in the main. And this whole idea that he ties up in the view of history, which he is emphasizing, where following the science of Newton instead of Leibniz, and the philosophy of John Locke instead of Nicholas de Cusa, this global elite have imposed their oligarchical tyranny upon mankind as a scientific dictatorship, and with the intent to reduce the numbers of ordinary human beings on earth and to enslave what's left of them. So this whole idea, we've talked about it from the view of the voices from the dust. Now we're seeing it from the view of people who don't know what the message of the voices from the dust is, and they don't even know about, probably, I mean, they've probably no doubt heard of Mormons, but they don't put it in this context yet. See, what they are pointing out is that the agenda of the elite has existed since colonial times and was perceived and held back by the efforts of the American revolutionaries, such as Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton, who looked in, you see, into this conflict between Leibniz and Newton, and the idea, the scientific ideas that they had, that then, they were using intellectually as well as spiritually to discern, what reality is. And of course, the idea that Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton were more aligned intellectually as well as spiritually with the more enlightened course that was laid out by Cusa and exemplified by Kepler, that man is capable of being much more than a useless eater. See, the idea that Newton saw the universe without God, and you know, something that just and today in modern terms we see it starting with the Big Bang and just sort of unwinding through natural processes that God doesn't even have anything to do with. That was the view that LaRouche is kicking against, not that he's replacing it with what the voices, the vision of the all that comes from the voices of the dust through the Book of Mormon that has been revealed, but through this alternate idea of Nicholas de Cusa and Brunelleschi. It's mispronounced. It's not pronounced like that in Italian, but that's the way they pronounce it in English, I guess. But it comes down to that man is above the animals and the beasts of the forest because he has this mental capacity to seize the moment creatively, as did Johannes Kepler, which he used when he used that ability to discover the solar system's true harmonic motions. So LaRouche would have us recognize that reasoning from the observation of creation to discern the nature of God and thus of man, the correct reasoning of a certain group of men was suppressed by an alternate group of conspiring men that would be those who were anxious to take Newton's view of a, if you look at Newton, he's very closely associated with the occult and with the so-called science, right? Those days of alchemy. And that all came from, of course, from this Aristotelian view. But it gets very complicated. But the idea is that you have these two groups. One science, we'll call them philosophers, because in those days they didn't distinguish really between the two that much. But Newton, on the one hand, who saw the universe as working more or less as a clockwork, you know, that fit very well into the theory of evolution that was to come later, where God's hand isn't evident, and Leibniz, who was arguing the opposite of the science of Newton, that led to other conclusions that were more aligned with Cusa, who understood this idea of the coincidence of opposites, he called. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming days, maybe, but it was very interesting. But the thing that we want to see here now is that LaRouche would have us recognize that reasoning from the observation of creation to discern the nature of God and thus of man, we had these two different opposed groups. One who were pressed into the service of the European elite, who determined to subjugate society through cunning and subterfuge. But the American revolutionaries discovered the plot, more or less. You know, they discovered the tendency, they discovered the leanings of the ruling elite towards Newton and company. And so they bolted from these imperials for a while, and we get the American experiment, as it's sometimes called, where the freedom of mankind is specified, and men are free to choose their own paths in pursuit of happiness. What is it? Free for the gee, now it skips my mind. But this idea of the pursuit of happiness or the ownership of property is what it was originally. This made it, the whole little saying escapes my mind right now. But anyway, I've been dumbed down, right? I'm part of the dumbed down generation. and to lead them to believe that they cannot do anything about their awful situation that they find themselves in. He presents Nicholas de Cusa's vision of God as the leading light in general, but as something incomplete without the contribution of Brunelleschi and Kepler. Brunelleschi showing the importance of considering nature of the very small in contrast to Cusa's contemplation of the infinite, and then Kepler's use of those two views of reality to solve the mystery of the solar system. So LaRouche then uses this analysis of a crucial scientific advancement which revealed the truth regarding the mystery of the solar system, and he compares it to today's scientific challenge, which is still seeking a solution in the very same terms. There is Einstein's discovery of a principle regarding the very large, the law of gravity, analogous to Cusa's, and Max Planck's discovery of a principle of the very small, analogous to Brunelleschi's contribution. And yet those two, Einstein and Planck, quantum mechanics and general relativity, cannot be reconciled until a Kepler comes along with a solution that uses both principles. Thus, LaRouche fancies himself as offering a Kepler-like solution to our awful social situation, where there is a conflict between the large-scale analysis of humanity's potential and the small-scale analysis of the individual's potential. The solution is found, he thinks, in the recognition of the sovereignty of the individual under God, as enthroned in the U.S. Constitution and the American Revolution, and the sovereignty of nations under man. In other words, men or society recognizing the sovereignty and dignity of nations as a whole. So tomorrow now, we're going to show how this Gentile view of God and man developed over centuries of struggle to understand God, not through prophetic revelation of the Lord's servants, but through the human reasoning, where man's attempt to reach out to God on his own terms is the major principle. And so we see then, what we're trying to do here is to draw this contrast between the Gentile view of the world, which involves man's reasoning, and the scientific approach, which of course is validated by this great blessing that the Lord said he would pour out upon the Gentiles because of their faith in him, that he would bring them here, deliver them from the tyranny of their mother countries and the great and abominable church, which was at the heart of it, and that they would then escape the yoke of bondage that was imposed upon them and be brought to this land, which is a land choice above all other lands and blessed above all other nations upon the land. But then he would cause a great light to break forth among them that sit in darkness, it says. So what we see is that the Gentiles came here and they were blessed tremendously, but they were in darkness regarding what? Well, regarding the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the true nature of God, and thus the true nature of man. So that contrary to what LaRouche is pressing here, that man is above the beast. Well, yeah, he is, of course, above the beast, above the animals, because he has this creative ability to seize opportunities of the imagination and be blessed that way, that we see actually come from God, because he's marching us towards this final day of judgment and so on that we see. But all of this contrasts with the view of man that was held by the Jews, see, by the prophets of the God of Israel that were recorded in the Bible. And now, as we see that confirmed coming forth in the Book of Mormon, as that recorded in the Book of Mormon by the voices from the dust. So that's what we want to do, is see these two visions in contrast. One where LaRouche is pushing it and serving the purpose that we have of articulating how the Gentiles see the world, so we can call it like a contrast between the Gentile view of reality and God's view of reality. Man's view of God and God's view of man. And so on the one hand, man's view of God leads to this reasoning, and we see this dichotomy in the reasoning exemplified in the thinking of Cusa and Kepler and this whole thing that LaRouche has brought to light, as opposed to Newton and John Locke, who was in cahoots there with the elite as well as Newton in bringing to pass this view that they wanted to impose on mankind, that he was nothing but a useless eater. And that's what has gained the upper hand today and what LaRouche is fighting against. But in the meantime, this black swan event that nobody expected comes about, that we call the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ, in connection with the restoration, the greatest restoration in all the world, in the words of Sir Henry Finch, that entails the turning upside down of the world as God restores his people and brings them to the knowledge of the truth, as the prophets foretold, and upsets the plans of the wicked. So for us to understand that is vitally important, so that we not only understand that we're above the beasts, that we are not useless eaters, but also that we are children of God with a great destiny that goes way beyond the solar system. And so we want to make that contrast clear. So I hope we can do that. And in the meantime, I hope you have a good day. And my prayer, as always, is that the Lord's choicest blessings will be with us all in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.